Welcome back to AutoTechNick, and today I'm going to be walking you guys through the process of performing a PPI on this 1995 Ferrari 456 GT. So the 456 we have in the shop today is actually a viewer of the channels. He does live local to me in the Seattle area here, and he does like to work on the car quite a bit on his own, but he did want to get the car in, have me run through an inspection, and really have me look over it. So that way we can kind of determine what items the car needs overall, and then we can even go further and figure out what items are things that he could address himself at home, and if there's anything that he would actually like me to address. I believe he's owned the car for about a year, so we say it's a PPI, but I guess it still counts. It's a post-purchase inspection. It's, from my end, there's no difference if I'm doing a PPI from when a client has purchased the car already or if they're about to purchase the car. It's the same inspection. I'm gonna go through the same detail. And these PPI videos, they really work great as kind of like a used car buyer's guide. So if you're looking to buy a 456, this really gives you a good idea of common things to look for and what you should be looking to find on the cars if you're looking to purchase one yourself and you're looking it over on your own. You guys can see that we're pretty full in the shop this week. There's a lot of cars in here, and where the 456 is currently at, I don't have much space to really walk you guys around and show you the exterior of the car and the detail of it. The first thing we really need to do is get the car out on the road, get our road test out of the way so we can evaluate it, its performance, its drivability, all the functions, get as much tested as we can. Once our road test is completed, we're gonna have the car up here on the lift. We're gonna have a little bit more space at that point. Then we can kind of walk around and just get a general visual of the car, and then we'll dive into the meat and potatoes of this inspection. Well, traffic doesn't look too bad. We're gonna have plenty of space in front of us, so we're gonna run it through the gears here, make sure our power delivery is good, make sure the clutch isn't slipping, and really just make sure that the car is handling and performing the way that it should. So we'll just wait our turn here. All right, see how she does. Ran good. Didn't sense any clutch slipping. Ran through the gears decently. And I mean, these things, they are just so long-legged. We barely got in the third. We're going plenty fast. Fifth gear, smooth, six. So the gearbox is shifting really smooth. That's nice. The car is tracking really well. Let's see our steering wheel alignment here. I like to try the kind of eyeball how straight the steering wheel is. Sometimes it really heavily depends on the road and how much crown you have. This steering wheel is a little bit off to the right, not too bad. So we're gonna jump off the freeway here and find some roads with a little less people on them. Turn our heater down here. So really the reason why I like to start out with the test drives before I really get into the inspection is it gives me a good idea of how the car really its overall condition, how well it drives, squeaks, rattles, clunks, noises. Is there any drivability issues? I mean, warning lights, we can already see that we have a suspension warning on our instrument cluster and our spoiler light is flashing at us. So it gives me a good idea that there's already some things that we're gonna have to look at or pay a little bit more attention to when we're doing our physical inspection of the car. Think of it as the test drive gives me a good idea of the car overall, but it gives me a bit more context clues of areas to pay a little bit more attention to when we're doing our physical inspection, because ideally I'm able to know, okay, we have a suspension light, the spoiler light's on. Ideally we know that they're on when we're doing our inspection. Maybe we find the cause and we don't have to get into any diagnostic time with them, which is ideal. I will say that the car is a little rough in the back, and that's one thing the customer did complain of. I talked to him and I asked him if he's replaced the accumulators, which he has, and his question was if the suspension light would be causing the rough riding and the default mode that the suspension fails in, which it's hard to say because a lot of times when these actuators and gears fail, There's really not a default mode that puts the shock in. It just is where the shock was at when it failed is the mode that it's in. That's the thing, again, we're gonna have to look at. I do physically check all that during the inspection. We're gonna check it with our SD1, so we'll get an eye on those. And you'll see me cruising through as we're driving the car. I'm switching all the modes of the heater. My aim there is to make sure that all the defrost flap doors are working, or not defrost, but all the doors are working, so all the different modes where I can change the air direction from the heat, the defrost, the dash vents, the heat's working, the AC's working. All those things are important that I want to check and get the operation. My ideal scenario is I check the operation of absolutely everything in the car, everything electrical, everything mechanical. So while we're driving the car, just kind of saves a little bit of time that we can run through, switch our modes, check that everything's working, and take note of it. Last time we came this way, the road was shut down for construction, and it's looking like it is again. All right, well, we'll have to take a detour. We'll just double back. And I kind of have an alternative to this route that we can take since we couldn't go the other way. It's a little bit of a bummer because that road's actually pretty fantastic. Some good curves, nice scenery. It's not totally urban, never much traffic on it at all. You know, moderate speeds. We're going 25, 30 miles an hour, which is plenty. Let's put the car through those corners dynamically and really kind of make sure it's handling well, but we're at a reasonable speed, especially considering we're here in such an urban environment. So you guys would probably be very surprised at some of the stories I have from things that I've noticed on clients' cars during the road test that they never even complained of. You would think that the clients would know firsthand if the car was lacking performance or had some big issues, but there's a lot of times, especially in some very prominent cars that I've worked on, the car gets dropped off, it has a complaint, and I drive the car and I'm just like, whoa, how are we not mentioning this issue? And, you know, we do a little bit of further looking and investigation and uncover a pretty big issue with the car. So that's really one of the main reasons why I like to get them out, get the road test done and evaluate it. Because if the car is new to the client, if the client's not that familiar with the brand or the car itself, there may be things that they just deemed potentially that's normal. And when I'm able to get in the car, I can determine quickly that that is not normal and kind of help give them that advice on something that we should look at or get corrected. And it really is, I can't stress enough how surprising it is sometimes of the items I've found. I think one of my most significant stories was, believe it or not, with an F40. The client dropped it off. They're complaining that the car was sticking at full throttle. I drove the car and the car didn't even have full power. I couldn't even run through the gears. It was breaking up pretty bad. You couldn't even shift it through the transmission. And that car ended up receiving a significant amount of work and ran beautifully when we were done. But my point being is none of that was anything the customer was mentioning or noticing when the car first came to me. And as soon as I drove the car, I wasn't even a mile in, I could quickly tell that there was a lot on that car that needed to get sorted out, which we eventually did, all because we noticed it on our road test. So this car has 41,785 miles on it, and honestly, it's driving like I would expect. It's driving well, it's tracking well. The suspension, drivetrain feels tight. The engine, smooth, linear power delivery. You know, all of our temperatures and pressures are in range. Oil temp is good. Water temp's where it needs to be. Oil temp's good. It's really driving quite nicely. I will say that there is a fair amount of interior noise in this car, so you know, if you guys can hear that squeaking up there, a lot of times, especially on some of these older cars, even if they have more miles on them, that leather tends to kind of rub on itself and start to creak and make quite a bit of noise. So this car is, you know, affected by that a little bit, but that's not necessarily a sign of a failure. That's just time and age on cars, wear, mileage, that all happens. If you're a really diligent owner and you wanted to go through, you could leather condition those things, and there's different products you can put in there that help make or eliminate that noise from those pieces. But it's kind of par for the course for a car of this age. I mean, we're 30 years old. Everything is wrapped in leather. Pretty typical, pretty common. And, you know, overall, it's not too bad. nice and smooth getting back on the freeway. I know I've said it, but man, I'm really pleased with this car so far. It is driving great, handling great. 40,000 miles on the clock. Really, the immediate things we notice right now, we got a suspension light. It also rides pretty rough in the back. We need to look at that. Our spoiler light's flashing. Another thing the customer complained of that I talked to him about is the car has a brake fluid leak. So we know there's a few things we need to look at, but overall, for a 30-year-old Ferrari, this thing is fantastic. I really pretty excited about this car. It's a nice, clean example. So let's finish up this road test, get it back in the shop. We'll get it on the lift. We're gonna move into our smoke test, our emissions test, our compression test, really give this car a good look over and see what its needs actually are. So we're back from the test drive. You can see that the 456 has the prime spot in the shop right there on the lift. Everything is rearranged, so now we're able to focus all of our attention onto this car and really dive into this inspection. The test drive went great. There's just really no red flags. Yeah, we got a couple warning lights we're gonna need to look at, a few small things here and there. Nothing big so far, which is excellent. Unfortunately, it's pretty late in the day for me, guys, so there's not much time left for me out here today. So here's my plan of attack. I'm gonna get the 456 inspected with the low-level stuff. So really, what I'll be doing is working through my inspection checklist here, and you can see that it's just a lot of the typical, what you'd see as a 101 inspection. So we're talking brake thickness, rotors, wheels, tread depth, oil leaks, oil level, coolant, suspension tightness, all that basic stuff, all the operation of the lights, just real easy, pretty standard, typical things that you're gonna check on any car. I'm gonna just spend some time and I'm gonna work through that today and pretty much call it a wrap for the end of the day. I'm gonna be out here tomorrow. I'll be able to bring you guys back tomorrow once I'm done with that inspection. Then we're gonna work into the stuff that's actually interesting that we're all here to see. We're gonna smoke test our exhaust manifold. That is a big, big thing. When you're getting an inspection done on a Ferrari, have the manifold smoke tested. We're gonna cover that. We're gonna cover a compression test on the engine. We're gonna cover our 5-gas emissions test, pre-catalytic converters on this engine, so we're gonna see how well this engine's running that way. We're also gonna get our SD1 out. We're gonna scan the car for errors and faults. We're gonna read the live parameters. That's gonna give us an idea of what's going on with their suspension. The stuff we're gonna be doing tomorrow is a lot more interesting, a lot more in-depth, and very specific to this 456. My plan for the rest of the day is to finish up this inspection, get the car prepped and ready, so that way I can bring you guys out here tomorrow and we can jump into that really interesting stuff. Good morning. Now we're back out continuing this PPI and this 456, and yesterday I worked through a lot of the inspection. I didn't make it all the way through, so I came out this morning, finished up the last of those loose ends, and spent some time just looking over the car. And I think we're now at the point where it makes sense for me to start diving in and doing some of the more specific tests that I told you I'd bring you guys along for. So since the car is sat overnight, it's the ideal time to get our smoke testers here set up, and we're gonna smoke test our exhaust manifolds. Now, there's a lot of talk in the Ferrari world of exhaust manifolds failing, and it's usually on, I'd say 430s, 360s, 355s. There's a lot of talk of that, the mid-engine cars. They do fail on the V12 cars, although it's not nearly at the same rate as the mid-engine cars, simply because the mid-engine cars get a lot hotter, especially like a 355 where the radiators are back there with the engine. But they still are prone to failure. They can cause problems, so it's still part of my inspection process. Now, on our belt-driven V12s, all of those cars have 4 exhaust manifolds. There's 2 per side. And where we're going to come in and actually test is our emissions test port. You can see right up there on our secondary air rail. And then we have another one kind of right down there, and it's the same thing on the other side. So I'm just going to run my smoke machine on there, and we're going to just put the smoke into the exhaust. Now, back at the tailpipes, I actually just take some, it's simple, just take some rags, stuff them in the tailpipes, and that seals it off enough. We don't need a complete perfect seal on the exhaust to run this test. It's okay if a little bit of smoke emits out from the back. Is really what we're looking for in the smoke test is number 1, the manifolds. I want to make sure that there's no cracks in the manifolds so I don't have any smoke whisking up outside of the heat shields, and also the flanges where they go to the heads. A lot of times you can break studs, the flanges could warp, there's leaks there. Those are the 2 main areas. But overall, broadly, I want to be sure that there's no smoke emitting from the exhaust at any point before our O2 sensors. That's the main thing. So a cracked manifold, that poses a whole nother set of problems because the manifolds can degrade, the metal can fatigue, it can break, and it can get sucked into the engine and cause damage. So that's our number 1 primary goal here, is to make sure our manifolds are good. But even if they don't get that far, if they crack, they actually, believe it or not, if there's a crack in the exhaust, will suck fresh atmospheric air into the exhaust as well as be pushing exhaust out. It just depends on the load and the RPM of the engine, the temperature of the exhaust. But what can happen is if it's sucking in that fresh oxygen, your exhaust is going to be oxygen rich. And your O2 sensor is going to see that and think you need more fuel because it's picking up extra oxygen. And then it's going to compensate with the ECUs, and they inject more fuel into the car, and the car didn't need that extra fuel. You just had a faulty reading on your O2 sensor from that extra oxygen. Then the car starts running too rich. It can really cause a lot of interesting issues with the adaptions with the ECUs while it tries to compensate. So that's why I say our number 1 priority is just checking to make sure that there's no cracks before the O2 sensors. So that's the main focus. Typically, when you see any issues with the exhaust manifolds, you're going to see the smoke whisking up here in the front of the engine bay real faintly, and then you can start kind of investigate or dig a little bit deeper in that area what you're looking for. But I mentioned the rags. They don't need to be that good of a seal. I almost prefer that they're not a perfect seal at the back of the car, because if I start having smoke emitting from the back of the car where I'm doing my test and I have no smoke up here in the engine bay, that tells me that I do have smoke in my entire exhaust system, yet no leaks up here if I'm getting it back there. So that's a good sign. So otherwise, if you have the system sealed completely off and you have no smoke emitting, then you can start questioning yourself, is my machine working? Am I putting smoke in? Do I have enough oil? Did it break? I don't like that. So I just stick some rags in there. It's real down and dirty. This test doesn't take too long, and I will mention that I prefer to do this on cold exhaust manifolds because there's less expansion in them and they're going to be more prone to actually show a crack or a leak when they're cold versus when they're warm. Not to mention, it's a lot more pleasant to work with when the exhaust is not blazing hot and the engine's cold. So I'm going to set you guys down. We're going to run through, make our tests on each of the manifolds, make sure that we don't have any leaks. And I'll say the V12 ones are pretty rare for leaks, so I don't expect to find anything, but you never know. That's why we check. We're going to hit those checks and see what we have, and then we'll move on to our next step. All right, so I already have the emissions cap off on cylinder 1, and I do say that it's generally good practice to get your smoke flowing here and turned on and make sure it's actually coming out of our hose before we connect it up. I don't know if you guys can see it, but it's definitely starting to emit some smoke. There we go. So I just like to make sure that it's working. Again, I've had it not work far too many times where I end up wasting time. So we'll slide that on and give it a couple minutes. And I like to use my LED flashlight here where I can kind of just look around and look for the smoke potentially whisking up from the exhaust, making sure that we don't have any cracks or leaks. And we do have some smoke here. I don't know if it's from our hose connection to the manifold or a manifold itself. All right, so we had a little bit of smoke whisking up, and that's from my rubber hose connection to the nipple port. The problem is it's threaded on where the cap goes, and a lot of times you can't get that hose to seal perfectly over those threads, and a little bit of smoke will emit up and out of there. So that's why I was just looking around, and I was really being sure that the little bit of smoke, I don't know if you guys can capture it on camera, but it's just whisking up right here. That's actually from my hose right here. It's not from a cracked manifold, but that's what we would be looking for if we actually did have a cracked manifold. I'm gonna see if I can drop you guys in and show you. So I hope this shows up. Get some light. You can see that smoke just slowly whisking up. If I zoom you guys down, you might be able to see where it's just coming out from those threads. But if you have a cracked manifold or a failed manifold, you'd see the smoke whisking up like that, but it would be coming from under the heat shields. So it's not ideal. I can work that hose on a little bit better to make sure that that is not, you know, it's not leaking, so that way it's easier to tell if I have a cracked manifold. But a lot of times if I have something like this and I question it, you can just blow that smoke out of the way and then check for other smoke. But it's pretty easy to tell right here that that's exactly right where it's coming from, right from the edge of the hose. And you can see back here, you could see before I walked back here, we had smoke emitting from the back of the car. If we actually get to the tailpipes, you should be able to see it whisking out. So that tells me the entire exhaust system is full of smoke. And just as long as we don't have anything coming out from anywhere other than where our hose goes on, that's manifold number 1, checks out A-OK. Let's check the other 3. Also, when you take these brass cap nuts off your ports, make sure that they're not cracked. If they get over tightened, they'll actually split and crack on the top, which can cause an exhaust leak. So always inspect these and check their condition. We'll put this guy back on the front manifold. It was pushing all of our smoke out since I had that cap off. And I'm only going to have those hand tight for now since we're going to be doing an emissions test here shortly. So we're going to have them back off of the car. No sense in tightening them all the way down. So we'll let this smoke clear out and get our inspection done on this rear manifold. So everything checked out on manifold number 2. Seal this back up. We'll come over here and check 3 and 4. All right, one more to go. And everything looks good. Looks like we don't have any leaking manifolds, so I'm gonna get everything disconnected and ready to move on to our next check. All right, so before we put the smoke machine away, we're done with the exhaust manifolds, but you can see I actually have it hooked up now to our intake plenum. I'm gonna hit each side, so I just took the covers off that sit above the fuel rails, have it teed in right there, and is what I'm checking for is I wanna make sure these plenum gaskets are good, but more importantly, I wanna make sure the intake manifold to cylinder head gaskets are good, because the early gaskets tend to blow out and fail over time, and there's actually, you can put the later gaskets on, which are the style that are on the 575, 612, which are like a metal core, and those tend to not fail as frequently as the old green paper gaskets. So I'm running that test in here now. Again, I don't have everything 100% sealed off, meaning like our throttle blade and all these ports and air boxes. So I would expect to see some smoke leaking out of there, but it's sufficient enough or sealed off enough that way if there is a gross leak on our exhaust manifold gasket, it's going to be very apparent with this test. So again, it's another quick, easy test just to check a very common failure point of 456s, which is intake manifold gaskets. So since our car is cold, and I kind of planned on this yesterday, I need to pressurize the coolant system, and I will prefer to do this when the car is cold because it helps expose loose hose clamps. Right here, case in point. When the system builds pressure naturally with the engine running, the pressure builds up at the same time that the heat builds up, which allows things to expand and seal. And if you pressurize it when it's cold, that exposes a lot of coolant leaks from hose clamps on these cars. So when I can, I try to work my coolant pressure test around the fact when the car is cold, so that way I can find leaks like we have right up here in this upper radiator hose. And typically, all they take is first the right tool, but we can get our little nut driver on here, and I can usually just give that a little bit of a tighten, and that seals it off right there. The leak goes away. It is a very, very common thing on these cars. So usually you come back through, and it's a different size hose clamp right there, and make sure that these clamps are nice and tight when cold, and that will be sure there's no leaks. And I've said this before, but you can really get burned if you have this car. Let's say I brought this car in after the test drive yesterday and I put this coolant pressure tester on it, the pressurize the cooling system when the car was hot, which I've done before. You'll pressurize it and there's no leaks. Everything looks good. And I like to leave my coolant pressure tester sealed off and on the car for a while so I can check for pressure drops over a long period of time. But what will frequently happen, this would happen to this car. As the temperature of the car came down, things would have contracted, that leak would have emerged, and then I would have put all of my pressure pushing that leak out, and then I would have came in the shop this morning to a huge puddle on the car of coolant because of that loose hose clamp. That's burned me several times as well. So I ideally, on every PPI, do a coolant pressure test. Ideally, I do it when it's cold because it helps things like that pop up. They're easy to rectify. We can get it tightened down, get it taken care of. If it was hot, we wouldn't have found it, we wouldn't have known, we'd have overlooked it. I'm gonna let this sit on here for a little bit longer to make sure that we don't have any other loose hose clamps or connections. I'll probably raise the car up, take a peek underneath, make sure everything's good. If so, we'll pop the coolant pressure test off, and it's time to roll in to our emissions test. Okay, so here's where we're at. Coolant pressure test turned out good. Didn't see any leaks from the car other than that one hose clamp that we tightened. So I got that all taken off. Obviously the car is running. I've had it running in the shop for a while. I want to get it up to full operating temperature so that way we can move into our emissions test. Now, I use just a snap-on 5-gas analyzer here to run the emissions test, and I'm going to go and take readings at idle on each of the 4 emission ports on the engine, and also a reading at 3,000 RPM. You guys can probably hear in the background, my cooling fan is cycling. That's one important thing to note. When you're doing this emissions test, I like to be consistent with everything that I do. So I should say, when you're doing this emissions test, I always try to get my reading, capture my reading when the fan's on an off cycle, not an on cycle. It's the same thing I do like on 355s when I'm balancing throttle bodies. I keep in mind the cycle of the cooling fan, how that loads the electrical system, how that loads the alternator, how that affects the engine idle and RPM. Now that this is all warmed up and ready to go, I'll take my hose down there. We're gonna get it on our little nipple right there, walk around the engine, get our readings. Then once I'm done all the way around, I'm gonna come back, do it again, but at 3,000 RPM. Now I will say, once I hook this up, is what I'm really watching for is my hydrocarbons. I found that the hydrocarbon reading is the most consistent, meaning once it finally stabilizes and stops moving rapidly, that lets me know, and I guess with the most fidelity, that I've purged all the air out of the system. I'm getting all the emissions gases into the tester, and that is the actual reading that I'm getting right there. At idle, it's pretty easy, but when you're trying to hold the car to steady RPM at 3,000, any acceleration or deceleration of the engine can change your emissions reading. So you really want to hold a steady RPM, be very consistent. And like I said, you have 5 different gases fluctuating in your face. I rely on the hydrocarbons. Once that's steady, holds true, I'll hit print. And I don't really go through and analyze and look over my information that much until I'm totally done. That way I can have the car shut off, less exhaust fumes, a little bit of peace and quiet, and I can kind of look and analyze how the engine's running. So I'm gonna work, get this hooked up, start pulling some readings, and see what we have. So I just got the hose hooked up on the manifold up here at the front for cylinders 1 through 3. And if we come over here, we're gonna see that it's starting to populate, and you guys will see that it's gonna take a while for our numbers to stabilize, and that's what I was really mentioning. Where it comes down to our hydrocarbons, that's what I'm paying attention to. So our CO, CO2, air-fuel ratio, that pegs pretty easily. The NOx isn't gonna fluctuate much. That's really what I'm paying attention to. At idle, it stabilizes pretty quick. It's pretty easy. It does take a bit more time when we have the engine revved up. All right, it looks like everything's stabled out, so we'll get our printout right here. And once that's done printing, we'll move our hose to cylinders 4 through 6, and then again, repeat on the other side on both banks. and then we'll move on and capture everything at 3,000 RPM. I'm gonna focus on getting the rest of this emissions read off the engine or printouts. Once I'm done, I'll see you guys back here in a second. So I just finished up the emissions test, and I will say, I did see some things that caught my attention. We're not gonna focus on those right now, like I mentioned. I'll come back when I'm done and look over those numbers really carefully, lay them out so I can kind of make sense from bank to bank what's going on. I do wanna keep that in mind as I work through the rest of the things on this car and just kind of keep it fresh in my head, because what I'm doing is I'm just collecting a bunch of data points, and that helps lead me to a certain direction. That's also one reason why I don't want to sit down right now and analyze those emissions results too far, because as we work forward into this inspection, we're going to be gaining more information, and it makes it a lot easier sometimes to piece everything together because we have more information at our hands versus just limiting ourselves to the results of the emissions test. So now that the car is warm, it's up temperature, it is the ideal time to move into our compression test. Now, when I do my PPIs for like a pre-purchase inspection, or in this case, a post-purchase inspection, I do give the client the option if they want me to do the compression test or not. Obviously, that dictates what I charge for the service. This client does want me to go through and do a compression test. So there's a couple key factors. I always do it with a warm engine. You'll see once everything's set up, I always have a stabilized power supply on the car, supplying a steady state of amperage and voltage to the starter, so that way it's consistent on the engine revolution throughout our compression test. And I always keep the throttles 100% open, so that way there's no issues within the plenum and air distribution. The valves and the cylinders have all the airflow they can get to it to get an accurate result. So we're going to move into removing the spark plugs and getting our compression test underway. I just want to take a note. On these particular cars, for the spark plugs to get them out, you do need a special tool. It's tempting to try to take them out without the tool. Invest in the tool. Otherwise, you're going to damage your spark plug wire and eventually be buying new ones, which we don't want to be doing that. As far as I know, there's 3 options for tools in the market for spark plug wires on these older Ferraris. There's the factory Ferrari tool. There's this tool here, which is a Hill engineering piece. And there's also a injected molded plastic piece that's made by Sticky RX, which I think is probably the most economical for a do-it-yourself guy. So those are the 3 sources where you can find these tools to pop the spark plug wires off. They work great. You need them for like 355s, 550s. I'm going to work through, get all the spark plugs out. One key thing, this is my go-to 100% of the time. Anytime I remove a spark plug from an engine, I label which cylinder it came out of as soon as I pull that spark plug out. A lot of times you get in a hurry, you take them out and you get them all mixed up, but if you don't do that, and then you look at the spark plug and see that there's a problem with that spark plug, you don't know what cylinder it came out of. And by numbering the spark plugs, and then we can look at the spark plugs when they're on the bench, look at the color of the burn pattern, how well they're wearing, the gap, that all gives us more evidence that we can use and leverage with what we saw in the emissions report, what we see in other aspects of our inspection. Like I said, more data points, and I'm not going to try to connect those dots until I have all my data points sitting in front of me. So let's move forward and get this compression test out of the way. All right, we're all set up for the compression test. Like I mentioned, stabilized power supply. That outputs 55 amps. So that's key to keeping my voltage to the starter consistent as I keep cranking this car over and over and over, especially considering that we have 12 cylinders. I take a jumper wire and I have that hooked up to the starter terminal and to battery positive here. So that way I can rotate the engine over up here. I like to do it that way because I don't have to have the ignition on, so I don't have to worry about any secondary spark coming out of my spark plug wires. And we'll jump in the car real quick, and you'll see that I use my pedal depressor right there on the steering wheel. It's hard to see, but it is down, holding the gas pedal in the full open position. That way there's unrestricted airflow going to each cylinder so we can have a consistent reading. I have found, my past experience, it really is dictated by your plenum style and size. But if you have your throttle blades closed, it will cause a low compression reading number, but also it can be very erratic from cylinder to cylinder based on how that plenum distributes air. Once you open the throttles up, I found that problem went away. So it's my go-to every time. Warm engine, stabilized power supply, throttles wide open. Now I'm going to show you right now, since we'll have a chance to peek at them, our spark plugs are out and they all look pretty good. And I don't really see any big red flags or anything alarming on them. So I'm pretty happy with those. I think the client may have replaced those semi-recently. I know that he did his own timing belts not too long ago. So he probably, I'm guessing, put plugs in then. So those are pretty new plugs. That's pretty much, we're set up and ready to go. I'm showing you the plugs now because more than likely I'm gonna put them back in once I'm done, and you guys won't be able to have another chance to see them because I'm gonna need the car running once we hook up our SD1, start going through our faults and scans. I need the engine to run, so I need to put the plugs back in. I don't want to pull them back out. Now there's one more very specific thing I do when I'm doing my compression tests, and that is being sure that I rotate the engine over the same number of revolutions for every single cylinder. Again, when it comes to stuff like this, consistency on everything we do is key because that gives us better results, better information. So when I start on the first cylinder, I am mentally counting how many times I hear a compression cycle on cylinder 1, which is where we're going to start. I'm also watching the gauge. I try to run the test for as short as I can until the gauge stops moving. From past experience, it's around 10 to 12 compression cycles on one cylinder. The needle stops moving, and that's what I count that, cylinder 1. Then when I go through and do the rest of the cylinders, I count the same compression cycles each time. I stop the test at whatever number I determine on the first one that I do. Then I get all my readings. If I have any outlying cylinders where they're really high or really low, I'll go back and retest them, maybe test a little bit with increasing or decreasing our compression cycle. If I'm getting really desperate, maybe we'll put some oil in the cylinder, see if we can have any influence on that reading. But again, if I'm measuring compression on all the cylinders, I don't want to spin one cylinder 8 compression cycles, the other one 14 compression cycles, one 6, because then there's no point in the compression test. We're not giving each cylinder the same amount of time to develop the same amount of compression. So, sit you guys down, let's get into it. All right, cylinder 1. About 207. Cylinder 2. 200. Cylinder 3. 210. Cylinder 4. 200. Cylinder 5. 205. Cylinder 6. 200. Come over here and start on bank 2, following the firing order. So this is cylinder 7 back here at the back of the engine. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So cylinder 7. Interesting. That's at about 178. All right, cylinder 8. 190. Cylinder 9. 175. Cylinder 10. 190. Cylinder 11. 190. And cylinder 12. 200. All right, so our compression test is done. I'm not super excited what we had. We had a pretty solid bank 1. Bank 2 had a couple strong ones around 200, a couple lower ones. So just like the emissions test, I'm not gonna scrutinize it right now. I'm not gonna look too deep into the compression test results. We're gonna wait until we have all of our information, and then we're gonna set it in front of us, and then we're gonna look at it in a little bit more detail and see if we can decipher if there's any issues or not. But truth be told, I actually had a late start today because I had some other things to come up this morning. Therefore, it is actually time for me to wrap today up, although we didn't get as far as I wanted to. The next step that I need to take care of is to get the spark plugs put back in the engine, spark plug wires put back in, and then we need to run through all of our tests with the SD1 where we're going to read out all of our faults and parameters from the Motronics. And that's also going to lead us into scanning things like the airbag control unit, reading errors and information out of that. But more importantly, that gives us a chance to get into the suspension control unit. We can maybe see why that suspension light is on. Same thing for the spoiler light, see why that's on. Just don't have time to get into that today. So it is my Friday out here, so I am gonna call it for today. I'm gonna roll into my other work weekend, make it through that, and I'll see you guys back out here next week. We're gonna carry on with our inspection on this car, finish up the last of the few things that I have to check, and then at the very end, once I have all that information, I'm gonna bring you guys along and just kind of show you things to look for, what we found, the condition of this car in particular, and also things to look for in 456s in general. I also might have a little bit of time to talk to the client with some of the information that I do have from this compression test, emissions test, and just have a little conversation with him on that. So I'll see you guys back out here next week. Welcome back. It is a fresh week out here in the shop, and we need to finish up our last loose ends on our PPI here. Now, what has changed since I left off last time is I've reinstalled all of our spark plugs, all of the ignition wires are put back on, so the car is essentially ready to fire up and run. The last of the things that I really need to take care of are all my scans with the SD1, and I already have hooked it up. You can see that I got it set up right now, and we're in both of our NCMs. So this is our right bank, and this is our left bank. And I talk about this a lot. Anytime I have one of these older cars on, this engine speed fault is going to be present anytime the key is on and the engine's not running. That's because these older computers are not able to differentiate the fact that the key is on and the engine's not running. It's not seeing an RPM signal, so it sets a fault. Once we fire it up, those go away. So those are all very normal. We have this AC compressor fault down here. I haven't looked into that. The AC is working, so I'm not overly worried. It could be a phantom fault. But what we're going to do is I'm going to get the car fired up, let it run and get warm. We're going to capture all of our faults when it's running and warm, but also is what we're more importantly going to be looking for is our parameters here. And this is my live information from the car. So like my load, my injection time, throttle angle percentage, spark advance, temperature, airflow, from my airflow meters on both banks. It's pretty limited on these older cars, but we want this information. It has our AC compressor status, all of our TPS sensors, and it should have on the third page our O2 sensor voltage and our fuel trims. And that's really what we want. We want to capture those when the car is fully up to temperature, running and at idle. And that's the information I want because I help use that to piece the pieces of the puzzle together on how well the car is running. Now, I have already scanned a couple of the other control units with my SD1 on the car, so I went and interrogated the airbag ECU, make sure there's no faults. We checked the parameters. Also did the suspension ECU, and I talked about that on our car when we were road testing it. We have a suspension light on, and I have to say, this car had more faults in that suspension ECU than I have ever seen on any car. It was like every fault that could be there was there. And there is so many faults in our suspension ECU, I actually did something that I very rarely do. I just went through and cleared them all. I normally don't do that. I like to work through the faults and diagnose them. I don't like to clear the faults from the get-go, but there are so many faults in this car, and I will jump ahead just a little bit, but I've already inspected the shocks and actuators. I'll talk about that here in a little bit. So I know the condition of those. So I went through, cleared those faults, and then we're just basically going to reevaluate and see if anything returns or not. It would be a waste of my time to start chasing all those faults that are in there, especially when I know this car has had some semi-recent suspension work, and those could be some phantom lingering faults that we have there. Again, I'm going to discuss all of the faults, the suspension issue in a bit more detail on the tail end, but I need to fire the car up right now, get it warm, get my parameters, read my faults. Ideally, I'd like to bring you guys along with that and show you why I'm working through the process, but there's a couple things that are going to prevent me from doing that today, and that's mainly the fact that this car is catless. With it being catless, it's wintertime in the shop. I have the shop sealed up. Even though I do have my exhaust fan in the back, I do not want this car to run very much in the shop. I want to minimize how long it's actually running because I need to keep the shop breathable, keep fresh air in here, and just keep it safe and healthy. So I'm actually just going to fire the car up, let it warm up, vent my air out while I'm doing that, and I don't want to burn any time filming. I'm going to capture my information so that way I can shut the car off as quickly as possible, get the shop aired out, and then that way I can talk you guys through what I need to talk you through, show you the things on the car, and we're not worried about breathing really bad unhealthy air. It's tough, especially in the wintertime in my shop with a catless car with minimal ventilation, especially when the car is backwards in the back of the shop. I guess it does help when a fan is in the back of the shop, but I still have to open the doors in the front to get some airflow going in, and it just makes a tough environment. So I'm gonna get the car fired up. I'm gonna capture this information I need to from our NCMs, and I'll see you guys back here once we have all the information in front of us, and I'll show you all the key areas and items that you need to look for on an inspection on your 456. All right, we're back. I finished up with our scans with our SD1. I've completed the inspection on the car. Now it's time to go over in detail what we actually found in the condition of this car, and also talk about the things that you want to pay attention to if you're looking to purchase or inspect your own 456. Now, before we jump over to the car and start talking about that, I did want to take a second and show you guys the information that I compiled that I presented to the client. So we're going to just start off here with my basic inspection checklist. This is like my very basic bare bones checklist of the car. I think of it as a broad level overview. I'm checking tire tread depth, brake pad wear, fluid levels, condition, just your basic. Think of it as a multi-point inspection. So I have that there. All that information is documented. We have the condition of the car when it's dropped off in terms of body condition, glass condition, paint defects, dents, anything there. So we have that notated. And up here, I primarily use this sheet when I'm doing my major services, but it also is used during my PPIs. So we have all of my emissions tests right here at idle and all of the individual cylinders at 4,000 RPM. Or I shouldn't say cylinders. Each one of these represents one of the exhaust manifolds, 4 exhaust manifolds total in the car. It's broken down that way because that's where I have access to get the readings pre-catalytic converters. We also have our compression test here, and you can see we have a bit of deviation. I think our lowest was right here at cylinder 9 at 175. And our highest up here is 207, but a lot of them are kind of hovering around 190, 200 is our average. So this one's a bit lower than we wanted, but I'm really not gonna be overly worried about it right now at this time. I did talk to the client that maybe when he goes in to move into his next timing belt service, at that time, maybe spend a little bit more time to rerun the compression test, see how those numbers hold up versus these current numbers. And if they're the same or worse, then move in, run a leak down test, and try to investigate why we have a little bit more of a deviation than we want. I mean, I would probably give this a B- or C+ rating. It's not bad enough where I'm going to say, hey, let's dig in and start looking for a problem, so to speak, and do a leak down test now. But before you start doing belt service and really tearing into the engine and investing time doing that labor, that's the time to check it. So it's one of those things we're going to keep in mind, put it on the shelf, wait for later, come back to. So we have all that information there that I give to the client. And this is really the same thing. This is the printouts from our emissions test right here, and that's from our battery test on the car. And I'll jump you guys over here to the computer. And here is the email that I actually gave to the client. So it has a broad description of what I found during the inspection of the car. It's really my impression and opinions of the car, just kind of giving him a high-level overview of the impression that the car gave me on its condition, how nice it is, and what its needs are. I will say there's more at the top of this email, but it's specific to the client, so I'm not going to show that. And then we're going to come down here, and a lot of this is all of this information here consolidated with all of my general notes in the car. And that's really the meat of my inspection. You can see it's broken down in all categories for road test, interior body, wheels and tires, chassis and suspension, engine. Our compression test results are there. And then we get into our attachments. The first PDF is actually all of this stuff scanned and uploaded to the email. And then the rest of these are my SD1 scans. And that is because I don't have an easy way to print them, so I just take pictures of them, attach it on there. So these are all of our errors and faults out of all the modules, really as the car arrived, giving a good indication of how things are electronically onto the car. All right, so the last thing I want to show you is the OneDrive folder of pictures that I give to the client. So this is photos of everything that I noted and found on the car. Go through, relabel all the pictures. If they need to, I'll go ahead and highlight and circle things that are in the picture. And this works really well when I'm talking to the client on the phone because we can both pull up those pictures and I can use those to talk them through the things that I found on the car and really the condition and things to watch out for. So there's a lot of information there that I give to the clients, and it takes me quite a while to get it all compiled and put together and over to them. It usually takes me the better part of a day. There's a lot there. So the PPI is, I mean, a lot of it is looking at the car, but it's almost just as much of it is taking all that information that I capture from the car, compiling it, and giving that to the client. On top of these videos as well, that's kind of an extra layer of these inspections that they get when they do the PPI. So let's talk about this car. We kind of talked about it. The compression test wasn't exactly how I like, and I also mentioned earlier in the video that the emissions test wasn't exactly how I liked either. This ties in with one of the client's complaints, and he has noticed that when the car does a cold start, it kind of seems like it's missing a little bit. If he revs it up, it seems to clear out and run fine. As we drove the car, it ran fine when it was warm. Power delivery is great. There's no issues. That showed up in my emissions test. So on both rear exhaust manifolds, so over here on cylinders 4 through 6 and over here on 7 through 9, I don't know why it was the rear ones because they really have nothing in common, but they were running pretty dirty in our hydrocarbons and CO at idle. It was actually pretty far off the scale. But then once I revved the car up to 3,000 RPM, they cleaned up and they ran beautifully. So my theory on our emissions readings comes down to the engine speed and really our ignition system. The emissions readings that I had were indicating that I had a poor quality combustion or a partial combustion in the cylinder. So it was igniting the air-fuel ratio or the mixture, but it wasn't doing a very good job of burning all of it. We still had raw fuel in the exhaust. Once we elevated the engine to 3,000 RPM, it cleared up and it ran great, and my emissions plummeted, and they got to right where they want to be. My best guess on this is at 3,000 RPM, there's a lot more airflow going in the cylinder. There's a lot more speed in the airflow, a lot more velocity. That creates a lot more turbulence. Our fuel and air gets a much better mixture in the cylinder, and it's easier to ignite. At idle, it's just really slow moving into the cylinder. There's a lot of vacuum in the intake. And if we have a weak ignition system, it's going to be hard to get a good combustion, a good ignition on that air-fuel ratio mixture, and a good burn in that cylinder. So I do think it's heavily related to the ignition system. And there's a couple things to notate on this car is, one, his spark plugs, we don't really have a history of when they've been replaced. They physically looked pretty decent. It has the right plugs in the car. It has a good iridium plug, but we have no history. So I said, that's kind of a maintenance item. We should probably consider putting plugs in the car. Another thing that we talked about is spark plug wires. At this point, this car is 30 years old. Those things don't last forever. They're still the original wires. And one of the other things, which is very common on all these cars, is our spark plug wire plastic covers are broken as well. This side's not as bad as we are over here. So they crack in a lot of areas, which is incredibly common. It's something we noted on the inspection. I talked to him about that as well. And I basically said, you know, given the history of the car, the age, the use, and those are unknowns, it would probably be wise to put some spark plug wires on it. It gives you the opportunity to replace those cracked, broken covers, put some good spark plugs in it, see how it runs. Chances are that's probably going to take care of that problem. It's going to clean the emissions up. It's going to run better. If not, we need to dig deeper into the engine, but we have a known variable that those things are taken care of, and we don't have to really question them. They're kind of a service item. At a certain point, you do need to replace them. Now, there's one more thing that I noted with this car that's a little unusual, and that is that it had a little bit more engine noise coming from the top end than I really wanted to hear. Now, it was nothing that set off a red flag with me. It didn't make me think, oh my gosh, something's completely coming apart, something's wrong, but it was not right, if that makes sense. I just listened to it and I'm like, it's just a little bit louder than they should be. It's one thing, I talked to the client, and this is a mechanical lifter car, and I know that the client has recently done timing belts himself. And I know the valve covers are off when he did that just from us talking. And I asked him, did you by chance happen to run the valve lash and check it? And he said he did not. And that's really another thing. So before, I really wouldn't want to dig into the engine and try to find out, you know, like go looking for a problem. But the next time those valve covers or cam covers are off the engine, 100% the valve lash should be checked and see if it's too loose, because it's kind of what it sounds like, that it's a little on the loose side. And that kind of all ties in together with our emissions issue, our compression test, and then that noise on the top end, where the car runs really well right now. There's no check engine light, there's no slowdown light, there's no loss of power. It runs great. He just did a belt service. I don't see anything that's telling us to stop, let's dig into this engine and, you know, start hunting around looking for things. But the next time he goes to move into a timing belt service, I did recommend, you're probably going to want to rerun the compression test, see where the numbers are at that time versus now. Probably we're going to expect to do a leak down test, do some investigation on that noise, have the opportunity to check the valve lash. Hopefully from doing those things, we'll find the cause of the issue. And maybe that's going to help clean up the emissions. You never know. There could be, maybe there's valve guide issues in this engine and it's just starting to show those signs right now. With it just getting timing belts put on it and the way that it runs pretty well right now, I don't see any point in diving all the way in to check those things. It's things that he needs to keep in mind for the next time he does belt service in the car. Now let's start talking about the things that you really want to pay attention to if you're looking to buy a 456 that aren't necessarily specific to this car. We covered it. Exhaust manifolds. Check those. You want to be sure they're not cracked, that they don't have any leaks. So you're going to have to smoke test those. You need to check the integrity of the intake manifold gaskets. Again, smoke test those. I'm very opposed to testing those with brake clean because that can actually ignite and cause a fire. But you want to check those. Very common those fail. We already talked about it, but the spark plug wire covers and spark plug wires, those wire covers cracking, almost all 456s do that at a certain point with enough age, heat cycles, in use. Very common. Some aftermarket spark plug wires you get come with new covers. You can get those replaced. And obviously the spark plug wires with the heat cycles and life of these cars, they don't last forever, so you should consider getting those replaced. Really, anything rubber in here, intake air boots, all these hoses. I mean, sometimes even these rubber boots on the wire harnesses, they have a real hard time withstanding the heat and life. So you just want to go through, visually check everything. Cam cover gaskets, so you want to make sure that the gaskets haven't pushed out, they don't slide out and start leaking. These cam covers have been off recently and sealed up in the same method that I use to seal them up, so they're in excellent shape. They're not pushing out, they're not leaking at all. Right here, you can see on our throttle cable, whoops, on our throttle cable, the heat shielding cracks and starts flaking off. That's very common on all of these cars, the 456, the 550. They pretty much all do that. It just depends on how bad it is. So it's one thing to keep an eye on. Really, at the end of the day, if I can still have my throttles calibrated and balanced correctly, where both TPS sensors read correctly, the vacuum is the same on both banks, and I don't have any other issues with the cable with it binding, I usually just let that ride. It's kind of a cosmetic issue. But if I start having issues in between the two throttles, I'll start digging deeper, looking at those throttle cables to make sure there's no problem there. Now, obviously, if you're looking to buy a car, you're going to want to know the history of the timing belts, when they've been done. But more importantly, I can't stress enough, it's not just if the timing belts have been done. You need to ask if the tensioners were done, but also find out if the camshafts were degreed. These engines are very sensitive to it. I have people reaching out all the time asking me how much it costs to do a timing belt service on a car, and very rarely do they ask what work is involved. Am I degreeing the camshafts? Am I replacing these seals? Those questions are so important in my opinion, almost more important than the price of the service, because it's really hard to compare services in between shops if you actually don't know what scope of work they're quoting you with that service. Not all timing belt services are the same. A lot of people skip corners, cut corners, don't replace everything. Now, I want to be clear here. I'm not saying all timing belt services are bad if the camshafts were not degreed in or all of the work was not done. Everyone has a very different opinion of what is included in a timing belt service. What I want to stress here is you need to compare the price of the service charged and the scope of work that was done in the service, not just the price of the service. Now, while we're under here at the engine bay, let's talk about our shock actuators for a second. So you can see that we have it right down there, since this is the Bilstein system, and we have our red actuator. I've already pulled the retaining clips off of the actuator, so I can slide this off of our shock and get it up and out. And you're gonna wanna check this plastic gear on the inside of this actuator. Now, if I kind of wiggle it around, it's gonna seem like it's broken, it's loose in there, but it's normal. That's how they are. You want to inspect that carefully to make sure that it's not split in half. Now, you're going to want to come to the top of the shock. There's a couple things, get our spark plug wire moved. A couple things you want to check. You want to check for oil down here, because oil leaks up through the shock shaft, up out to where this adjuster is, and it kind of gets wet there. This one has some oil that's kind of just saturated on all these items. It's probably hard to see on the camera, but you can definitely see it in person. And that is an early sign of a leaking shock. Also, this aluminum gear right here on the top of the shock shaft, you want to make sure that that's not cracked, that's not broken. You want to make sure that it's not bound up, that you can rotate it from direction to direction, that it's smooth and it's free. You need to run this check on every single shock. So I've done it on both front ones. On the rear, there's two bolts on the rear of the underbody or from the wheel well. You pull those bolts out, the suspension drops down, you can get to those actuators to check those shocks there. Every time, check those, because there's so many problems that happen. You have leaking shocks, you have broken actuator gears, and you have broken gears on the shocks themselves. Now on this car, we had a suspension light on, so I was actually figuring we were gonna have an issue with a shock actuator, and I was gonna be able to walk you guys through that. I inspected all four of the shocks in this car, although we have a shock here that has a little bit of leaking. All of the gears in the shocks are good. They churn from inlet to inlet without any obstruction. Everything is clear. All of our actuators are good. And when I interrogated the suspension ECU, it was littered with faults, with having the shocks basically locked up or bound up. So that's meaning that the actuator is unable to turn our shaft, and that's why it's setting a fault. So I'm gonna give you guys a real quick crash course on how these shocks work. There's end limits on this actuator on our shock, so it only rotates a certain amount. It's let's say 300 degrees before it stops on its min and max setting. So these actuator motors and gears will spin endlessly, And all of our potentiometers for the position of our shock are inside this right here. Now, when we put these back on, after we check them, the orientation does not matter. As long as they fit, your wire looks nice, you're set. When you first turn the key on, those actuators are going to run a self-test, and they're going to run all the way to one in limit until the shock physically stops the actuator. It's going to pause, it's going to read the degree of the actuator, and it's going to spin all the way to the other in limit until the shock physically stops the actuator. It stops, it reads the degree of the position sensor. That's its self-calibration of the min and max. Every time you turn the key on or cycle the key, it runs that self-test. So the way it sets a fault is if that shock is physically bound up and it's unable to hit the degree range that it's looking for, sets a fault. Or if it just spins endlessly and doesn't have end stop, it sets a fault. That's how those actuators store faults in the suspension system. I had faults for bound up actuators that they weren't working. I physically went and tested everything or inspected everything. Everything was good. I usually don't like doing this, but I just went through, cleared all the faults out of the suspension ECU, went and cycled the keys, wanted to see what came back. Nothing came back. I was able to use the SD1 to manually move each shock individually from its max limit to its minimum limit and monitor the angle of it with my parameters and my actuations. I did that on all 4 shocks individually. All of them worked flawlessly, no issues, no faults returned. Now, the client, when I was talking to him about this issue, he did mention and notice something that I noticed as well, and that's a lot of these shocks have writing on them. A lot of the actuators have been marked for the positions, right front, left front. So there's a good indication that somebody has done something with the suspension, repairing the actuators, replacing the shocks. Really, I don't know. And my best guess is there was a bunch of old faults stored in the suspension ECU that were never cleared out, and that's why that light was there. So I just went through, cleared everything out, and it has not returned since. We function test our shocks, all 4 individually, everything's good. We'll take the car for a drive when I'm done just to be sure nothing returns, but really before I invested a lot of time diagnosing it and really chasing my tail into it, I kind of wanted to make sure that I just wasn't chasing old errors, because that's kind of what it felt like, kind of what it looked like. And if there is a legitimate problem, it should come back pretty quickly, set another error, and I don't have to work through all that clutter of those other errors to see what shock it is and then look further into the system. But it's a pretty basic system. Really, you just want to make sure that it's cycling both ways, the gears are good, actuators, everything's free. So I think that's pretty much it when you're looking at the top side of these cars. Really anything rubber in the engine bay, we talked about that. You want to make sure it's good. The coolant hoses on these cars are typically silicone from the factory, so you don't have to worry about those. And obviously you have stuff like, as these cars age, the powder coat starts to come off the intake manifold and valve covers. So there's a lot of things to consider age-wise. I will say while we're up here, headlight motors are fairly common. They start to fail. They have an internal position sensor in them, so they get a lot of water intrusion and corrosion and they stop working. You don't necessarily need to proactively go and check those, just function test the headlights. If the headlights are coming up and down and not doing anything weird with getting stuck up or cycling up and down, then there's really nothing to worry about at that point. There's people that offer services to rebuild these motors. They make improvements on the inside, but it is one thing to keep an eye on, function test, but you don't have to chase after. Check for leaks, coolant leaks, things of those natures, but really the big ones on this, intake manifold gaskets, oil leaks from the cam covers, exhaust manifolds, age and history of timing belts, and overall condition of everything inside the car. Let's get the car up in the air and start looking at the other side and talking you through that. All right, so the car's up in the air and I still have my suspension down from checking the actuators, so I wanted to drop you guys in and show you. So you can see with the shocks unbolted right here, there's just enough room to work this off where you can get your inspection done and get everything checked out. And I will say that on something like this, you're gonna need to do both sides at the same time, otherwise you're gonna be fighting the sway bar and you're gonna be unable to get the suspension dropped down. Now, one thing I wanted to touch on since I described how these do their self-test, that is why it doesn't matter on the orientation of where I put this in, because this actuator is splined here to fit into this body or this top part of the shock right there, and obviously it has to fit onto our shaft here. That's why the orientation doesn't matter whatsoever, is because of that self-test that it runs each time, so you don't have to worry about any of that. It's actually really nice. You can just pop them off, slap them back on. Once you check everything, make sure they're good, and you don't have to worry about the clocking or orientation of them all. Just slide them back in, kind of rotate them so they fit into the grooves, This one's going to be difficult on me, doing it one-handed here. There we go. Just get them popped in, just like that. Get our shocks reinstalled, and I'll continue on with our inspection. So I'm going to take a second, get these put back together and buttoned up. Then I'll bring you guys back. We'll crawl underneath the car, and we'll start talking about things you want to look at and some of our findings on this car. All right, so we got the car up in the air. We'll just start back here at the rear, and we really have good view of everything with our gearbox and transaxle back here. Since it's a 456, we have our self-leveling suspension. That's probably a key area to talk about. So our shocks right here, you can see we have a hydraulic line coming into them. This line is fed right here from the accumulators. This is the charge line from the power steering pump. The accumulator basically acts as a capacitor or device that absorbs very sharp and sudden impacts from the shock. Since it's hydraulically filled with ATF, the ATF that's in the shock dictates the ride height of the car. If we hit a sharp and abrupt bump, the shock can't correspond quickly enough. So the accumulator has a bladder inside with a nitrogen charge. It can compress, allow for that immediate change, allowing the shock to live its life. Now, on the last 456 we had in the shop, I actually had a failed accumulator on it. I just had the car at the gas station. I filled the entire car up with fuel, which all that fuel sitting back pretty much right on or behind the rear axle. So I added several hundred pounds back here on the car. Pretty much the first bump I hit with a failed accumulator, it caused a rupture on the side of the shock body because the shock body cannot withstand that pressure. And they split, all your fluid leaks out, causes a big mess and a lot of problems. You have to replace the shock. Now that's an extreme example. You can see we have new accumulators here. I've actually had several of these shocks fail on me. It's like while I'm driving cars. So as these cars are getting older, the gas charge in those accumulators slowly leak out. They disperse. The bladder basically gets pushed on itself. It's no longer able to function. The shock can't handle the forces. They fail. So accumulators are basically a maintenance item in these cars. Replace them every couple years. The accumulators are a couple $100. The shocks are a couple $1,000. Cheap insurance. Plus these are getting harder to find. Now, while we're talking about shocks, they are known to leak from the top up right where the shaft comes out of the top of the shock. You'll see oil leaking down on the shock body. There's plenty of people that offer a service to rebuild the Bilstein shocks, so that's relatively normal to have them leak. You can get them rebuilt. Usually you don't have to replace the shock. And while we're talking about our self-leveling suspension, this is our control valve right here, and that controls how much fluid goes into the shocks. With zero hydraulic pressure back here, the shocks will be fully collapsed with the vehicle weight on it. It relies on the hydraulic pressure in the shocks to raise the rear of the car up. You can adjust your ride height right here because this lever that's bolted to the sway bar, if I spin you around right here, is what's controlling our valve. So if you loosen up these bolts and adjusted this lever with the car running, you'd see your rear suspension start to raise and lower accordingly. So that's where you can make those adjustments and changes right there. That's a crash course. Definitely get the history on the shocks and accumulators. This customer's already replaced his, as we can see, so that's nothing really to worry about. But that is probably one of the biggest problematic areas on the rear of these 456s as they age. We have our gearbox mounts. You can see how close they are to our exhaust right here. They sit right up on top. These ones are in decent shape. They're not collapsing too bad, but that is an inspection point. Check the integrity of those mounts. This engine and gearbox, it's connected with the torque tube, and there's basically the two mounts back here at the rear and our two engine mounts at the front, which hold the entire assembly in the car. That is it. So you want to get a visual inspection in there, see if they're collapsed, see if everything's starting to sag, check the condition of the rubber, make sure there's no cracking, there's no problems back there. As for a gearbox back here, there's really not a lot we can do. The main part of the evaluations during the road tests on the shifting quality and smoothness. But while it's in the shop, we're going to pull our fill plug, we're going to check the oil level and condition, making sure it's good. We talked about the shocks, self-leveling, engine mounts. We'll bring you over here. This car is a great example. Suspension bushings. If you look right here, this is kind of some of the normal cracking you start to see on the rubber of these bushings as they start to age. And this cracking right here is where I start to say it's getting a little bit excessive. I've talked about this before. The cracking, all these cars, they're all going to exhibit some sort of cracking unless the bushings have been replaced. It's just a matter of the age of the car. I usually notate that they're cracking and I let it ride. And then once we start looking like this, where it's actually separating, there's big chunks and it actually looks like some serious deterioration. That's where I'll just tell the client, we really need to keep an eye on that. Inspect those during every service and really keep an eye on making sure the car drives good, it tracks well, it handles good, that there's no noises, no clunks, no squeaks, and that our tire wear remains good and even, no feathering, no wearing on the inside. So that's basically when that bushing fails and gives, we're going to expect to maybe hear some squeaking from the suspension, maybe some clunking. The car might track weird, or we're going to see it in tire wear. So we just need to pay extra attention, since this one's cracking pretty heavily, that those are the symptoms, and once this bushing actually goes and needs to be replaced. And this is something I would not replace just that one bushing. It would be all the bushings on the upper and lower control arms, inner and outer. And honestly, I would do the front if we're doing the rear. So that's a really significant job. That's a lot of work, a big expense. So we just want to keep an eye on that to be sure that we're not doing it prematurely and the timing is right. And that is something that's situational, depending on the client's situation, the car, and their desire for its condition. Some clients, like this one, he's okay with it. He's just going to monitor it and drive it. I've experienced other clients that see something like that and they're just like, nope, replace everything. So it's just my job to document the condition and let the client know what the options are and what to keep an eye on. Now, while we're back here talking about rubber, it's kind of hard to see, but you're going to want to check your CV boots. They're kind of buried right up in there and also right there. Again, it's rubber. Check for micro cracking, splitting, torn open boots. Anything with a car this age that sees as much heat as these do back here, I can't really see this one. Give those a good inspection, a good look. Make sure they're in good condition. And it's really a matter of, we're inspecting its condition right now, but also the condition in the long run. So making sure they're good now, but also trying to advise the client how much life is left in them the best that we can. And I think the last thing to talk about back here, fuel filters, one on either side. This is one of those things kind of leveraging what I talked about earlier. Timing belt services, I always replace all the fuel filters. I date them. Some people, when they're doing timing belt services, they don't replace your fuel filters. I also replace all my gearbox oil, basically every fluid in the car. So a lot of people always mention timing belts, but for me, it is a major service, a lot more than just the timing belts get replaced. Case in point, our fuel filters here. And I'll give you guys a peek right here. This car, the center resonator has been removed and these straight pipes have been installed in their place. That was that way when this client bought it. So we did talk a little bit about potentially putting an X pipe in the car because it is a little raspy when you're driving it at times. And the X pipe's really going to help move the tone of the exhaust up in the frequency, and it should help get rid of some of that rasp. So that's one thing that we did talk about. This is honestly the first time I've seen this setup. If we peek, it's also got test pipes. This car has no cats, and it's shockingly quiet. It really is surprising. It's, the fact, I should say, no cats, no center resonator with factory mufflers, and it's not unreasonable at all. My only complaint is the little bit of rasp it has, so maybe an X pipe right here would help fix that and correct that for the client. And yeah, let's get moved up to the front and start looking around up there. All right, so here we are at the front. You can see I have the under tray back on the car, but we're going to be able to inspect everything that I want to talk about. And here's kind of what I was talking about, where this car has been driven in weather and it's kind of greasy, grimy, and gunky. You can see the buildup and just the grime that's on the car. And that's a combination from this car probably previously having the oil leaks that we talked about, like on the cam covers, and it being driven in the weather. That's not a bad thing. It's really not. It's just notating that because, like I said, this is actually more uncommon than it is common to see a car with that kind of buildup. A lot of these cars aren't driven all the time in the weather. Jumping over here, you can see we got some oil dripping. We have one high one up there, one low one right here, and this one right here is probably maybe coming from our oil filter. This guy right here is either coming from this front cover on our timing cover right here, or this back gasket right there. That one, that could be from our power steering pump up there. We would have to pull these covers and investigate. This kind of ties in with everything else that I talked about on the top side of the engine, where right now there's no point in chasing after this. Yeah, it's a nuisance, it's dripping, it is leaking, but it's not dripping so much where we're going to lose oil and it's going to jeopardize the health of the engine. It's just a nuisance at this point. In order to reseal this front cover, you have to pull the timing belts. So it's kind of the same thing. There's no point in chasing after it now. This car has fresh timing belts, but we're going to keep in mind and advise the client, next time he does timing belts, he might want to consider replacing this front cover gasket. And on that last 456 we had in the shop where we did recover or replace that front cover gasket, I talked about if you're pulling this front cover off, you might as well replace all your bearings for your timing shafts. There's just really no point not to. You're there. The outer bearings are not lubricated by engine oil, so it's a good chance to get those replaced and serviced, and they're really not that expensive in the grand scheme of things. And another one you can't see well, but our balancer. You need to check the rubber membrane from the inner hub to the outer ring of the balancer. They crack, they split, it can come off. This balancer either is going to come forward and come off the car or go backwards, and it does have the potential to go into your timing belts. You can get a mirror in here and inspect it. It's hard to really get a good view. It's one of those things that you inspect during a belt service. You're going to have the balancer off. You give it a really good look over. If it's questionable, replace the balancer or have it rebuilt. As for oil leaks on the rest of these engines, they're really not too bad. Really the only other area that likely are going to leak is right there, which is our oil drain from the cylinder head, and it's just a piece that is bolted onto the head and sits in an O-ring in the block. There's an O-ring on the head, O-ring on the block, and that's where you're going to want to leak. But this has a lot of oil down here, like I mentioned, and this is where I was saying that I think that's from the cam cover gaskets, to where this really would just need to be cleaned off, and then we just kind of keep monitoring it and keeping an eye to see if this is old oil or if there's a current leak. I don't think there's anything current. I mean, there is the junction from the upper oil pan to the block and the lower oil pan here, but those are not common to have leak, although it is possible. And this one's not really too bad, but it's kind of what I was mentioning earlier. Like I said, it's just a little bit dirtier than they typically are. This car has just been driven and used, and when it started to develop a leak, the previous owners weren't as, I should say, worried or proactive on getting them fixed and or cleaning them after the repair. It's not jeopardizing anything now. It's just not pretty, and it makes it harder to work on, and harder to tell if there is an active leak now. So you just need to spend a little bit of time, elbow grease, and get them cleaned up. And we can see here where we have our factory manifolds, and then the test pipes are welded on. Since this car is a 95, it's an ME 2.7. We only have O2 sensors pre-cats. There's no post-O2 sensors, so the car doesn't know. It's unaware that it has no cats on it, but we have that. And really on the front suspension, it's a lot of the same things, like right here on the sway bar bushings. You can see they're starting to split and crack. Sway bar bushings here are different because the sway bar is only rotating. It sees very different loads than a control arm bushing, but you can just see it's same thing. It's rubber, it's aging, it's cracking. Right here, dust boot here on the ball joint. You guys are catching a trend. Anything rubber, starting to go with time. But you want to check your rack boots, all your bushings. Obviously, we're checking your suspension tightness, any looseness in there. And really, there's not a lot of visibility, believe it or not, because there are manifolds on the engine, but we're checking leaks, condition of everything. There's no way to check the wear of the clutch on these cars. It's just a matter of how the car drives. But honestly, I can tell you that throughout the years, a clutch replacement on these is actually pretty unusual, especially these cars, these Grand Touring cars. They're not driven, as aggressively, or they don't see as much track use, so they're not really abused as much. The clutches tend to have a really long, easygoing life in these cars. But that's pretty much how we talked about the rear engine mounts. You can see this passenger engine mount. We have great view to that guy, and that's usually the easiest one you want to check. And we're checking up here, if I can get you up, where you can see where that pad, how close it is to the bottom frame. Checking the mounts, and you can usually tell when they've been replaced. It's obviously nice new shiny metal, or you have history of it. This side, quite a bit tougher. We got the steering rack in the way. It's a lot harder to check those mounts, but you want to check those because it's just those 4 mounts, like I said, holding the entire drivetrain in the car. And I'm trying to think, that's pretty much everything. We have some of our ABS pumps up here, secondary air up here, non-return valves, acceleration sensors, cooling fans, oil coolers. So you just make sure there's no leaks up there. Everything's good. And trying to think. A lot of times you want to check your brake cooling ducts. They start to deteriorate over age, start to split and tear. But specific to the car, 456, like I mentioned, I think suspension, ball joints, shocks, that's all pretty common. We all know to check that on cars. But the key things you want to look for really is the control arm bushings where they're starting to go, like in the rear. This oil leak, I hate to say it, It's very common. I'm starting to see it a lot more frequently. You know, it's not a big oil leak, but it's a nuisance. So it's one thing to consider, because really that is a repair of opportunity. It's something that you only want to do when you're doing a belt service, and you just have to decide when you're on a belt service if you want to address it then or just wait down the road and let it drip or leak. It's, again, it's a very situational repair, but it seems to be more and more common these days. And I'm trying to think. I don't think there's much else underneath here that is incredibly specific that I want to touch on. I think that pretty much covers it all. So let's get the car on the ground, and there's a few more things I want to point around on the top side and in the interior. So the car is back on the ground and off the lift, and I do need to jump backwards and talk about something that I should have covered when we were talking about the engine. That is our CAT ECUs right here. You need to get up underneath and check the color of the potty and epoxy on these ECUs. Either use a mirror or just unbolt them, pop them off. And you want to check and see if that epoxy is either black or green. The black ones are the older, pre-updated style CAT ECUs. The green ones are the newer, updated style. The green ones are much less prone to failure, although they still do fail. The black ones will fail. Now, easiest way to remember which ones you want to be looking for: B for bad, G for good. Green is good, black is bad. So definitely want to inspect those and look. Like I said, on a 456, you can just take a mirror, get under there, inspect them, you know that they're in good condition. On this particular car, it actually happens to have two black ECUs, although neither one of them are having any issues or troubles or warning lights. So if that's the case, like it is on this car, I say just leave them, let them be. But once he starts experiencing a slowdown light, don't even chase after it. Just put in new ECUs, reevaluate it, and see if there's a problem, because it's more than likely just the ECUs. Now let's talk about one of the 456's more notorious issues, and that is the window fitment, or I should say window regulator. This car is actually a very good example of a well-fitting window, where we can see it sitting up along this door seal all the way, and there's no gap where you can see into the car or wind can get into the car. It has a nice tight line, everything works good, and obviously when you open the door handles, the windows need to drop down so you can open the door and they don't interfere with the seal. So this one's actually working really well. The last 456 we had in here, I actually had maybe 3/4 of an inch gap over here. And on that car, I ended up getting the window regulator rebuilt. I replaced the guides, and that took care of it. I did try to go and adjust that window, but which is pretty typical when this happens, is I will try to adjust the window to see if I can save it, but almost every time it's a window regulator issue. There is a aluminum pin in the scissor mechanism, and it wears out, allows too much play, and then the whole window regulator loses its ability to keep its geometry, and the end result is a very poor fitting window. There's companies out there that rebuild and modify the window regulators with a stainless steel pin, and essentially I'll try to adjust it. I'll give it a little bit of time. If it doesn't adjust and it's never been rebuilt, I'll just tell the client to take the window regulator out. Let's get it rebuilt. I replace all the plastic guides, plop them back in, and usually once that's done, all the adjustments fall back into place very quickly, and you can get a good, nice fit. So it's one of those things that if you're looking to purchase a 456, ask the history if they've known that the window regulators have been updated or not. Also, check your fit of your window, because if this doesn't fit well, I would just anticipate that you're going to need to have your window regulators removed and rebuilt. Now, as for the rest of the body of these cars, there's really not a whole lot more to talk about. Any of these Ferraris that are getting older, your hood struts, they're going to start to go. Same thing with the trunk struts. Those are very easy to get replaced, very common as these cars are aging out. But it's really the window regulators are probably one of the biggest issues on 456s body-wise. There's really not a lot of other issues on them. And every car is going to be different on the condition of the paint, condition of the body, dents, any corrosion, stuff of that nature. But this is the one specific thing that you really want to pay attention to on how those fit. So I'm going to jump you guys into the interior, because there's a couple more things that are very specific that we want to look at on a 456. So I brought you guys over here to the passenger side of the car, and we're here in the footwell area, and what I wanted to talk about is our fuse box, because this is an area you're going to want to inspect while you're looking over a 456. Now ignore all this aftermarket wiring that is pre-existing in here, and what we want to focus on is our fuse box itself and our connectors. Now in our high load circuits, there is a tendency for them to overheat, which causes a lot of corrosion and damage to the metal connector here. And it can get so bad that it actually will melt the plastic connector that houses it into the fuse box and can cause issues to the fuse box itself. So I actually come through and I'll unplug each one of these connectors all the way across and inspect all of them for any signs of overheating, any corrosion, any damage, anything outside of the ordinary. Now we have to come down here anyways for our inspection, because this is where we gain access for like our connector to test our rear spoiler, our suspension ECU, our airbag control unit, and obviously our connectors here for our NCM. So we're down here anyways. You might as well take a couple minutes, inspect the fuse box, and make sure everything's good. And speaking of high load circuits, there is one thing that I did not mention, and that was with fuel pumps and 456s. There's issues with the fuel pumps, like we mentioned, causing damage to the fuse box, but also there's basically rubber isolators inside the fuel tank back here, which you access from the trunk. And those rubber isolators hold the fuel pumps and the fuel pump baskets and hold everything together in the fuel tank. That rubber deteriorates. It turns into a slimy, gooey gunk, and it can start to plug everything up and get into your injectors and cause problems. And there's also plastic check valves in the fuel tanks. Those can crack, cause fuel vapors to get into the cabin of the car. Now those are not so easy to proactively check. Neither one of them is. You have to remove all the interior of the trunk, physically get to the fuel tank, and check all your valves. As for the fuel pumps, there's really no easy way to find those. I should say a lot of times you find it after you start experiencing problems with the engine, fuel injectors getting plugged. Is what I've been doing lately is anytime I do a service, I'm replacing the fuel filters. I make a habit now to cut the fuel filters open, pull the paper element out, and inspect the fuel filters. That allows me to look at the paper of the fuel filter to see if any of that rubber from the fuel tank is in the fuel filter. Hopefully giving us a good indication of the health of what's in the fuel tank without having to go through all the expense of getting into the fuel tank. So that's one thing to keep in mind. You can't really check that on a PPI, but that is something that if you're looking to buy a 456, that is a problem area that they suffer with. 550s are the same way. 575s, they updated the fuel pump style. It doesn't have the same problems. 612s, they're newer. You don't need to worry about it. Now, for the rest of the interior of the car, I think it's pretty straightforward. Sometimes there's a few items that may be sticky with the soft touch finish that you might have to have addressed, like these handles here in the seats. And actually, speaking of the seats, they should auto forward when you move this seat back like that, and then cycle back once you bring it back. So that is one thing that commonly fails on these cars. The operation on this car is actually intermittent for either seat. So that's one thing you want to check. And for the rest of the cars, they don't have a whole lot of items that get sticky. Like I mentioned, they have the handles here. You have your steering column trim, your hood release. There's a few items, but most of the stuff has this silver finish on it, which does not get sticky. So that's kind of a good thing that 456s have going for them as opposed to a lot of the cars of the era. But just like any car of the era, the leather condition is critical. So you can see that we have a little bit of deformation there at the passenger airbag to the dash, and a lot of the areas, this car is actually in really good shape leather-wise, but this leather, there's really no way around it. As it ages, it starts to shrink. Well, there's two problems. It shrinks, but also it starts to lift off of the substrate because the glue breaks down. And a lot of times, like in little nooks right here, the leather will shrink off and create like a little bubble or pocket, or the leather can get where it's just loose on the door panel in different areas. Sometimes on those back panels back there. Like I mentioned on this car, it's actually, this leather is really good shape. There is on the driver's door panel, it's lifting right there in a few areas, and there's a few small areas where it's doing that. Obviously we have our airbag there, but it's one thing to inspect because depending on how fussy you are and really what you expect out of your car, that is something you may have to address. So if you're looking to buy a 456, this is kind of more of a tip on that, is really look over the leather. You know, the binnacle where it meets up to the dash, that tends to pull off the back. So if you don't want to, you know, if you want your car perfect, that's one thing you have to chase through or go through and address. And there's really no way around it. Some upholstery shops can re-stretch the existing leather and refit it to what you have, but otherwise you're looking at getting new leather because it's just an issue with the leather shrinking. So it really just depends on your shop, how bad the part is, the shape of the part, if it can be repaired. But really, when you're doing the inspection, like I mentioned, it's function test everything. Every switch, every button, every light. Make sure everything's functioning. Run your windows. Make sure your AC is running from, full cold, full heat. All your gauges are working. You can see that we have an issue with our center vent coming out. There's a couple things of the interior where they're loose like that. That all comes down to plastic tabs breaking. Again, this comes down to the age of the car. It's plastic. The plastic gets brittle. It breaks. And you have issues like that. A lot of these parts are no longer available. So you're just buying used parts that are the same age and have the same brittleness to the plastic. So it gets tough to address those things and replace them, but it's just stuff to look over so you can get an idea of the condition of the car. But 456s on the interior wise are pretty solid cars. They don't really have a lot of specific needs. There's not a lot of soft touch in there. I think the fuse box is one of the biggest ones. Fuel tank is one of them. And really, like I said, leather, that's every single Ferrari issue. I'd say that's any issue leather on a car that's 30 years old. With this much leather, you're going to have those kind of issues. So you just want to make sure all that stuff's good on the steering wheel. And that's really, I think, all the main talking points that you want to look at while you're looking over a 456. So overall, this particular 456 is actually in really good shape. It doesn't really have any immediate needs that need to be addressed right now. I do think that when this car is due for its next timing belt service, there is going to be a bit of a bigger timing belt service than is normally done. We want to look into that compression, get that leak down done, check our valve lash, see what's going on there, really investigate with some of that stuff, maybe address that front cover leak. But really, this car is a great driver. You drive this thing year round. It's in good mechanical condition. Got some things we've got to keep an eye on. Those suspension bushings, we'll see how those, age. But at the end of the day, this is still a front engine gated V12 Ferrari, and it is hard to argue with that. So I think that's about everything that I wanted to cover on this 456 inspection. So hopefully you guys picked up a couple tips or tricks, whether it's going to help you on your own car or if you're looking to buy a 456, gives you a couple things that to look for while you're inspecting that car before you make that purchase and get that deal locked in. But as always, guys, you know the drill. I appreciate your support. Thank you very much for watching the channel. It means a lot to me. For those of you that have signed up for the channel membership, special thank you for you guys. I really appreciate that extra support. As always, guys, you know the drill. Be sure to like, share, subscribe, drop a comment below, hit the hype button. Appreciate you guys for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.